Well, hello there. This is a video of 7 lessons or ideas that I wish that I knew 10 years ago. These concepts cover a wide range of different topics such as money, relationships, and motivation, and I've specifically picked them out because I think they can apply to everyone and not just me. Like I said, these are things I wish I knew when I was in my 20s, and whether you're actually in your 20s now, coming into your 20s, or even if you're later in life, trying to delve with and understand these concepts can only bring you benefits. And the first one is how money works. And coming from a computer science background, I actually did an internship after my 3rd year of university, which gave me some exposure to some of these different ideas and financial concepts. However, these were more or less in isolation, and I didn't actually see the bigger picture and how all these things tie in with the large scale economy and day-to-day events. Even after this internship though, finance was still a bit of an alien topic to me, as I didn't really understand the whole idea of wealth, how to attain it, and why is it that rich people, when it comes to taxes, are able to make use of certain concepts in order to maximize their income and revenue, whereas poor people and people who are really struggling don't understand these concepts, and I would have considered myself in this latter category. Money was never something I had in abundance, but even if I managed to collect some savings over time, I didn't really know what to do with it and how money works over the long term if you're able to invest it in the best possible way. Obviously, finance is a broad topic, but one of the most fundamental things to understand is the idea of compounding. The main idea behind compounding is not that you need huge amounts of savings all at once, but rather little and often can often be a better strategy over a long period of time. And again, you'd be surprised what this can actually amount to, and I'm going to show you an example here to illustrate this point. Here you can see what a reasonable amount of savings can lead to over the long term if you're able to be consistent. And again, this is why consistency is key when it comes to compounding. The reason why this works is because you end up earning interest on your savings, but this interest isn't a fixed amount that you end up earning the same amount each year, but instead, the interest that you've earned from one year can actually be then used to build further interest the following year, or in other words, you end up earning interest on your interest. The other interesting thing about compounding is that it doesn't just apply to finance, it can apply to other areas of your life too, such as your relationships. Because again, the trust that you build over the long term with someone like a romantic partner can actually compound to a point where the kind of relationship overall strengthens and strengthens until you reach such a point where the level of trust and the quality of that relationship is something that you couldn't otherwise reach without that compounding over the long term. So if you want to understand money and finance in more detail, then I have 3 book recommendations that approaches things from 3 different angles or perspectives, and they are Rich Dad, Poor Dad, The Algebra of Wealth, and The Psychology of Money. The next lesson is the importance of embracing discomfort, as surprisingly, this is actually the best route to having a more peaceful life. It's natural to assume that a path to a more peaceful life is actually to strive directly for peace and avoid anything that puts you in danger or any kind of harm. Personally, I find that this is a real light bulb moment when you first realize that this isn't actually how the human body or brain works, and instead, we actually adapt to different fears and scenarios when we're directly exposed to them. So if you have any kind of specific fear, the best way to overcome it is not to run away from it, but instead to face it ideally in a controlled and safe environment. So take for example the fear of public speaking. What's actually happened is this fear has been building up and building up over time because you haven't gathered any evidence that contradicts your original belief. The idea isn't to throw yourself straight in the deep end and put yourself on stage in front of an audience with thousands of people, as this can be very overwhelming. In fact, it can be overwhelming even with a small audience, but this is a much better environment, particularly if you choose something that actually helps with your progress and is supportive and nurturing. For me personally, public speaking was one of my biggest fears in my teenage years and early 20s. And again, once I realized that the best way to overcome it is to face it in some kind of way, I joined Toastmasters, which is a great way to build up that confidence over a long period of time, even though your first session or even first few sessions might still be overwhelming, but this is perfectly normal. Overcoming any kind of fear or developing any kind of skill is very similar to driving a car for the first time, where at the start, there's so many different things vying for your attention, everything is overstimulating, and you don't know what to actually focus on, so instead it becomes quite a stressful experience. But with practice, your brain ends up automating the things that are less relevant, and you can focus on just one thing, which is what's in front of you, without actually having to worry about all the things that can be taken care of in an automated way. There are various reasons why the younger generation in particular are experiencing higher levels of anxiety, and part of the problem is that they're encouraged to find safe spaces all the time rather than to embrace these fears and actually conquer and develop through those challenges. If you want to learn more about these topics, I'd highly recommend reading the books The Coddling of the American Mind or The Anxious Generation by Jonathan Haidt. The next one is how to recognize a healthy relationship, as your ability to actually recognize a healthy relationship is heavily correlated with your ability to actually be in one. There are various falsehoods that we seem to just naturally fall into unless we are shown otherwise, and one of them is the spark and the whole idea that the only thing that matters when it comes to chemistry and finding the right partner is how you initially feel about them. Another variation of this is that you'll know it when you see it, or when you first meet the person, you'll know instantly that they're the one. The problem is the way the human mind works is actually when it comes to romantic relationships, we tend to value or seek familiarity over what's good for us. What I mean by this is that if we grew up in a particularly chaotic childhood environment or something that was very volatile, then over the long term, when we grow up to become adults, unfortunately what ends up happening is we end up seeking a more volatile relationship, as this is what our minds are calibrated for, and we end up assuming that this is what a relationship should be like. But what inevitably ends up happening is we end up in an unstable relationship with a lot of volatility, and this can end up adding a lot of stress over the long term and a lot of frustration. However, because this is our familiar environment, we end up in this state where it's like a roller coaster, where some days is absolutely great and other days are terrible. And in many occasions, you're on the verge of exiting the relationship, but then you have a high moment and this pulls you right back in. And this is what keeps you trapped there over the long term, against the idea of your happiness. I know it's not very romantic to say, but a huge amount of what makes a good relationship is actually a science, which means if you either follow the right kind of steps or you know what to look for, you end up putting yourself in the best possible position to have a long-term happy and healthy relationship. One of the main concepts that underpins this whole idea is evolutionary psychology, and this is an area that I really got interested in over the last few years, and it's really helped shape my perspective on what humans actually end up gravitating towards and what kind of things we should truly care about. If you want to learn more about these topics, I'd recommend reading the books How to Not Die Alone or The Evolution of Desire. And the next one is How to Recognize and Limit Addiction. And this one applies even if you think you're in a secure environment, as things can change rather quickly, but at the same time, if you're struggling with some kind of addictive behavior, then knowing about this can really help. The first part of this, which I eventually came to understand, is that we live in a world of abundance, not a world of scarcity, which we're actually designed for. So take something like food, for example. In ancestral times, we didn't know when our next meal was going to be, and what often happens is that we get a lot of food all at once, and then we may end up going through days without having our next meal. This was our body's way of adapting and evolving over time to be able to store fat, because this was Mother Nature's way of being able to cope with this exact problem. And this doesn't just apply to food. Similar parallels can be drawn from things such as social media, video games, and many other substances and behavioral patterns. The other thing which I only came to realize quite recently is the whole idea of the pain-pleasure balance, and this exists within each and every one of us. The best way to visualize this is to imagine a scale from 0 to 10, where 5 is the default and baseline level. This is the average set point that most people find themselves in under normal circumstances. And what this scale actually means is that when you lean towards 0, you experience more pain, and when you lean more towards 10, you experience more pleasure. But as the saying goes, there's no such thing as free lunch. So if you think you can get some kind of shortcut towards pleasure, what ends up happening is your body overcompensates by tipping the balance back towards pain. So over time, what this ends up looking like is that you end up having a small window of pleasure, which is your shortcut, and this could be in the form of drugs, alcohol, or even certain behaviors. And then outside of this window, the balance tips more towards pain. So every time you take this shortcut towards pleasure, you end up experiencing more pain outside of these windows. So what this can end up looking like is your day-to-day baseline level of happiness could be a 2, 3, or 4 out of 10. But then you end up having very short-lived windows where it's an 8, 9, or 10. The more you go down this route, the more you end up convincing yourself that the way out of those moments of pain is to seek more pleasure, and you end up having more and more of these mini pleasures in order to compensate for the pain, but over the long term, pain ends up becoming more of your default state. This is the mechanism by which addiction occurs, because you end up seeking more and more of these highs to offset those lows, but in reality, those lows were actually caused by those highs. The truth is, our bodies and brains are not designed to thrive with extreme highs, or in other words 10 out of 10s, and instead we should seek more stable highs such as 7s or 8s, which are actually attainable under normal circumstances and healthy methods. So really this comes back to the previous point. By seeking certain types of discomforts, or in other words simulated forms of pain, we can actually tip the balance more towards pleasure, so our daily experience is not just a 5 out of 10, it could actually be a 6 or a 7, whereas we go through small moments of 3 or 4 out of 10s to actually generate the possibility of having most of the time in that 6 or 7 out of 10 spot. Some good examples of some of these short-term pains that generate more of these long-term rewards are things such as cold exposure, acupuncture, and exercise. If you want to learn more about this very topic, I'd recommend reading the book Dopamine Nation. And the next lesson is the importance of self-imposed guardrails. I spend most of my life with the belief that the more freedoms and options we have, the better. But actually what I've come to learn is that we actually need to limit our focus so that we can actually move forward. In many ways, this is what philosophy and many different forms of religion intend to help you with. Honestly, the world is just too complex to navigate without some kind of guiding principles. And in the past, we would have got these from village elders or our religion. If you think about it, it's very obvious that this is the case, as many different institutions impose these different rules and guidelines in order to help the societies thrive. Governments write laws in order to keep the peace, otherwise the entire world will descend into chaos. And in terms of religions, take Christianity for example, we have the 10 Commandments. It doesn't actually matter if you're religious, or even if you are, which religion you end up belonging to. What matters is that you have good role models, and the kinds of rules and guidelines that you end up taking on yourself come from good and noble sources. A bad person can take a good or noble idea and twist it into an evil or deceptive one, so it really matters who you end up looking up to and where you get your information and your values. Another aspect of this, which is very relevant in modern times, is the ability to filter out the noise so you can focus on the signal. And this particularly applies in social media, where there's so much information and most of it is not healthy or helpful to you. So instead, being able to filter out what doesn't matter and focus on the things that actually improve and benefit your life is a key to a good one. 2 book recommendations I have are Essentialism and 12 Rules for Life. And the next one is The Hidden Power of Randomness. And this is probably the one that most people don't fully understand or appreciate, and in a way I'm only really getting to grips with it now. Randomness is a broad topic, but I'm going to use 3 examples to illustrate where most people go wrong and how understanding these things can give you a more accurate perspective and help you think more rationally. And the first one is the whole idea of luck versus skill, and there's actually a cognitive bias or blind spot that tips the balance and skews our perspective when it comes to these things. For example, when things go our way, we tend to attribute much of that success to our own ability. When things go badly, it's often easier to blame some kind of external force or entity, or even luck. The next one is survivorship bias, which basically means we tend to remember the things that worked and completely omit or forget the things that didn't. For example, when we think of billionaires or people who've made it very successfully within their industry, we often attribute much of that success down to a few small things, whereas in reality, if it was as simple as that, then we would expect a lot more people to become successful, because in reality, many people are actually doing those things, but we're only focusing on the people who actually made it. The next one is the narrative fallacy, which basically means we're trying to attribute meaning to things that could be completely random, and we're trying to connect through cause and effect and stories that make sense of what we've actually observed. 2 books that can really help you understand these concepts are Fooled by Randomness and Thinking Fast and Slow. And the last one is to be aware of status games. It's amazing when you read more into this, but you come to realize that most of the world is actually dictated by different types of status games and their respective incentives. The truth is, status games are unavoidable and necessary, but you should choose them very carefully, as they are often zero-sum games. What I mean by this is that the games are hierarchical, and there can typically only be one or a select few winners, and most of the people end up being losers. A good example of a healthier status game is sports, but if you think about it, it's a status game because at the end of the day there can only be one winner, and most people fall short of that. Broadly speaking, there are three different types of status. The first one is social status, which involves fame, wealth, and social connections. The second one is virtue status, which can descend into moral superiority. And the third one is success status, which involves achievements and skills. But there are various problems with status, as I alluded to earlier, and one of them is status anxiety. Because status is so fundamental and hardwired within us, and failure to attain any status can be catastrophic in the worst case scenario, then this can lead to this feeling of status anxiety, which can cause a whole ripple of negative mental health effects. This is why I say it's very important to choose your status games wisely, because getting involved in the wrong ones can lead to very negative results. One example of this, albeit an extreme one, is how billionaires tend to compete with one another. They often try to buy a bigger boat or a bigger house to outcompete the other one, but again, this leads to a lot of insecurity and a lot of status anxiety, despite the fact they're in very privileged positions. The other problem with status is that it's fundamentally unequal, so you end up in a situation where many people are disproportionately disadvantaged and a few select people end up in a very good or privileged position. Like I said, some status games are necessary and important to understand, but many of them can actually be discarded as they do you no good. And if you want to understand some of these ideas in more detail, then I definitely recommend reading the book, The Status Game. Anyway, I'm going to leave it there. I hope you got something from this video. If you did, I'd really appreciate if you could like, subscribe, or leave a comment down below. But otherwise, I will see you in the next video.